Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lisa Scarsiga, running for State Board of Ed in Congressional District 1, and I am here today having a conversation with Tony, and well-known education advocate and former candidate himself. And so I'll let Tony introduce himself to the audience.
Sure. Hi, Lisa. Thanks for having me on your chat today. And first and foremost, I want to just thank you for running. As you mentioned, I'm a former candidate, and through that experience, I have a heightened admiration for those that run. It takes a lot of courage and fortitude to put yourself out there. So thank you for running, and especially as being a female candidate, I know that brings all sorts of extra layers. So I wanted to just start there and appreciate you for taking such a great step. My name is Tony Pigford. A little bit of background about who I am. I'm a fourth generation Denverite, third generation product of Denver Public Schools. I come from a long line of social justice champions, entrepreneurs, and specifically on my maternal side, educators. My grandmother, Florida Pitt Waller, was an educator in DPS. There's a school named after her out in Green Valley Ranch. She sacrificed her life for Denver's kids and did so much. And then my mom was a teacher and principal in Denver Public Schools as well, and a pioneer in multicultural, gifted, and talented education. And then I'm lucky enough to be married to a wonderful woman and teacher who has been a DPS school teacher for 14 years now, and a DCTA member. So I think a lot of my educational lens looks through being an African-American male coming through the Denver public school system, as well as that historical experience on my maternal side in particular of coming from a family of educators. I've chosen to sort of take a non-traditional approach to my work, and that I've been the boys' school at Denver, because I think there's a great need for our boys and social emotional intelligence and how we socialize our boys. Currently doing some work in Aurora Public Schools for boys of color in particular. And so I, like you, I'm just trying to put my hand on the boulder and push it uphill and do the best for our children. And so that's a little bit about me, and I'm happy to be here.
Great. Okay, that's wonderful. So I worked for Aurora for 14 years, did a lot of analysis and work, and we'd had reports through the years about students of color, particularly Black boys, and we've done different initiatives. Seen some movement, but of course, as you know, how you describe that's perfect, that rock uphill, or whatever that is, trying to move that boulder. So I'm glad you're there. I'm glad you're there. That's great. I still have an affinity for the district, so.
Nice.
So what would I understand you have a couple questions you'd like to ask, maybe a couple prepared questions if you want to get it started, and then we can chat.
Sure. Through my experience in the school system, I never necessarily felt like I could bring my full self to the classroom. And part of it was because I didn't see any teachers that looked like me. I didn't have a single Black male teacher from K through 12. And so I know that you're interested in hiring great teachers and retaining great teachers. I'm just wondering what your role would be on the State Board of Education to ensure that we are hiring teachers of color, and beyond that, retaining them and supporting them so that they're not going through the same experience that I went through.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good question. So when before session kind of came to a crashing close, we were working on a bill to do a study, and studies, I kind of hate the idea of doing studies. Like, we haven't, I read the Bailey report, we've done all this stuff, but sometimes you need to have current and relevant data to convince people, particularly with this legislature. So working on a bill with Rep. Coleman to study the pathways and where the roadblocks are for educators of color in our state. So where the state board has intersection there is we do have the connection to teacher preparation programs in our state. It's the only higher ed connection that we have. So we have direction, and so we can direct and require departments of ed, right, or higher ed to within their standards or within their recruiting, right, to number one, change the way that they're recruiting teachers so that they must recruit more into their programs, more teachers of color. Then there's other roadblocks we've discovered around getting licensure, which that is the State Department's role, is licensing teachers. And it's everything from some of the tests that they're using to the cost of the test, the multiple times some teachers have to take it. And other states have made changes in that area and have seen influx of teachers of color. So those are the kinds of ideas that, at least on a state board level, we can remove, and this is the thing, is remove some of the barriers that the teachers are telling us are preventing them from getting into the field to start with. And then you've got potential grants and programs, and this I have to look at because in our funding world right now, this is awful, but where do we attach some accountability and some incentives for schools to follow through? And I want to say that because a lot of districts have made these claims and they've made these plans and they say we are going to, and one of our equity goals is to recruit and retain teachers of color. What exactly are you doing to, particularly to retain? Because this is what we're seeing in Denver, right? We're hearing a lot of this. You get them in, and what are the teachers telling you they need for support? Are you following through with that? Maybe that's a part of the unified improvement plans. I got to kind of investigate and see where that flows. But from a state board level, that's where I see some of the touch points just immediately.
Oh, I appreciate that. And unfortunately, or sadly, my experience in DPS as an educator has been similar to that as a child, in that it's not a very welcoming experience. And it's been hard to gain traction and maintain a strong presence within that system. I mean, the recognition with the Bailey report and all of that is great. And I implore you and encourage you to, yes, we need more current data, but I think we also know what some of the solutions are. And I love your point about the licensure. And I look at my own experience and that of others who would potentially make great classroom teachers and educators who have wonderful professional experience, need training, and so forth.
Yes.
But a way to make the licensure process a little bit different without sacrificing ensuring we get highly qualified teachers in the classroom and finding that balance. So thanks for touching on that. I know you've talked before about expanding the criteria for measuring what a good school looks like and ensuring that test scores are part of the piece, but kind of widening the lens and being sure that things that community members and teachers and students think should be criteria for measuring a good school. And I like that approach, grassroots up, but I'm just curious on your end, when you think about those measurements and expanding the criteria and its impact on specifically students of color and Black boys, what types of measurements would you like to see added that would directly impact that demographic?
Well, when I was in Aurora, so we did, well, let me back up a little bit. I'm on the Denver Reimagining the SPF committee, right? And so this is quite current. And Massachusetts, I think, has got a model that I like the best. So just kind of put that there if you ever want to look it up, of how the work that they did. And they don't start from, what data do we have? Well, then let's put that in. They say, what is it we define as a quality school? Then what data do we have that we currently could use to measure? Everybody's got test scores, we got enough of that. But what are the test measures that we're missing? Do we have some data that will fill that? If not, how do we make those measures, right? And that's what they did, and it takes time. It takes months, it takes years, and they do it with the community. The community defines what is it we want to see. When I was in Aurora, we did surveys, and surveys are important, right? Because you can do focus groups and you can do meeting with groups, but when you got 40,000 students and you want to hear voice, we created a student survey. And we also created the first teacher survey, working teacher survey, that the teachers across the state picked up and started doing the same survey as well. I found those to be excellent ways to ask questions directly. So do you have an adult in the building that you can trust? Do you feel that discipline is fairly given in this school, right? And then you take that information and then you disaggregate it. We make it anonymous to the extent that we don't provide the information out to individuals, but we ask, what is your race, what is your gender, what all those things. And then you get a look, at least a dipstick, and it gives you that warning system, right? We would see schools where we would see certain groups of students that were disenfranchised or said, I don't have anybody I can trust. Things are not fair. My peers don't believe that I'm smart, right? All these things that we know that are nuanced, I think are a great way to bring those in. It's always in context. So you have to be careful. You don't want to just put one question on a survey and say the kids think the school is great, kids hate the school. It's more than that. But those are on an ongoing basis that you can do for all schools. Those are the kind of common measures that you can use. You also do then look at discipline and disparate impact on discipline, right? That should be a part of it. And we have that data. We don't make it so public all the time, right? And you get these core requests and people, that's where we find out the federal department of, just drew a blank. We do our biannual every 2 years. We turn in all of our information to the Office for Civil Rights. It's the Office of Civil Rights Data Collection. We get that information back. I know it's on the department website, but I know it's very buried, and that needs to be brought up too. So those are the kind of things that I think of, that there's information we have we can bring forward that we need to use. But I think it's student voice can be brought into, and is like missing in almost all of these kinds of measures as far as what is a quality school, because nobody better than the kids that just went through who tell you, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think the student voice and leadership component is huge. And, I agree with your approach typically, and I encourage you and other allies in this work that aren't people of color to be the champions for the data that we already have, and to be sure that it doesn't continue to be buried, because sometimes it gets frustrating from a community member's perspective, as an education advocate's perspective, to continually be asked, what do we need? What do we need? What do we need? And I'm going to just throw a few things out there as if we were having one of those exploratory sessions now about some of the things that I think are needed, and then from our community in every school, and potentially metrics that could be used in every school. A lot of that you touched on is the discipline and restorative justice practices.
Yes.
And ensuring that restorative justice, and a particular type of restorative justice, is implemented in every school, and that we don't put that burden on educators of color only, because that contributes to them getting sort of chewed up in the system. Is a lot of the deans are Black, but they're not school leaders. They're not, and they just
have seen this for years. Yes.
Yeah. And I've experienced that myself, and we're tokenized and used to hold the trauma of the Black students, and it's unbearable, while trying to champion diversity, equity, and inclusion, and all that. So I wanted to talk about the restorative justice, implicit bias training woven into professional development year round. I don't like the phrase cultural responsive teaching practices. I prefer culturally proactive practices. I think that we should create multicultural classrooms and experiences, just period, not based off of reacting to what students are necessarily in the room. And then I've heard you talk about this a lot, and I know it's on your radar, the trauma-informed care piece.
Yes.
Because I think that, and especially now post-COVID-19, well, we're not post-COVID-19, we're in the middle of it. But I think that a lot of the trauma that our poor students, our special ed students, our students of color have experienced with the COVID layer on top, that trauma-informed care piece is going to be huge. And so those are some things that I think are just super duper important that I wanted to put in your ear, and love that you mentioned the student voice and leadership, because my experience has been that students as young as elementary school If you build up their self-esteem and get them to understand how they impact those around them, they're perfectly capable of not only changing school environments, but community and districts. And so
Yeah.
empowering that student voice is huge.
Yeah, I've done work with kids as young as fourth and fifth grade, and they do generally after about third grade, they're able to do it quite well. Yep.
And I don't know how we're doing on time. Lana, do I have time to ask one more question?
Yeah.
Okay. And again, this comes from the background of some of the work I've done, but I'm curious what you think about the status of our boys in particular, not just boys of color, but boys in particular. I think that there's been and needs to continue to be a huge emphasis on girls' empowerment and women's empowerment, and we need
Yes.
women in leadership positions for sure. But I think that we've, in a way, lost a couple of generations of our boys, and how we're socializing them in school settings in particular is creating hyper-masculine boys that become mass shooters and sexual assault perpetrators and the ones caught in our justice system. And so I was wondering what you thought about the plight of our boys in particular, and what ways you could impact improving their success.
Well, so I've not been asked this question, and that's and it's a very good one. And of course, I have a son, you know, and I have brothers, and I have seen the change from a data perspective, which is what I used to do, right, in accountability. Just the success and the almost the flipping of life, right, where it was all male dominated and then females here, and now it's as if you're female, your likelihood of being successful in school and getting and doing all these things is far higher than if you were a male. So how do we bring that back into balance? I think it goes back, you know, I always think about leadership, but it goes back to the structures, right? Our structures in schools, everything from discipline, from the curriculum, from all those pieces. And when we look at them and we select them and we have these leaders making decisions, who's asking the question, how will this impact boys differently than girls? Are we intentionally or unintentionally adding to this? What do we see? You know, when you do those schools should do self-analysis, right? And we talk about this in defining what a quality school is. They should be doing, you know, having these visits, and you get these groups around. I think that question just isn't being asked. So it's one of those that you can't address it if it's not being asked. I don't know. I honestly have to go back and think to myself, where are some of the root causes inside of our education system, outside of the fact of, and I could probably throw a number out there and everybody's going to believe me because they think I know, it's probably 90%, 95% of the women our teachers are women, you know, and everybody will probably believe it. But there's undoubtedly, that is a part of it. It's always been women in education, though. So what's different from 3 generations ago to now? What has changed? We know the history of Denver. And I'm thinking you're talking, you know, it's nationwide, but particularly CD1. And so I would give that more thought. I really would. I would look for thought partners like yourself to say, how is it that I tweak that lens in, right? To say, is this going to actually have any positive impact on boys, or is this just going to keep the status quo, right? I think that's I think what you have to do, because I'm not sure we know. It's certainly got to be a very complex, right, issue. And I'm curious as to what you think, from what you have, your experience and your background, what you think some of the issues are.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, and sometimes part of the reason I don't have any hair left is because I think that we're not asking the right questions sometimes, and the fact that that question, as you were saying, isn't asked quite often, which to me, it's shocking, because I think that a lot of the ills that we're seeing in our society are stemming from how our boys have been socialized, whether it's greed or war or abuse or violence or I think that just generally boys grow into men that take a different approach to life in the world than women do, generally speaking. And
Yeah.
I'm not trying to exclude anyone. And so I think that what we can do first and foremost is start to like look at what's happening in schools and see how what we're doing in schools around boys is solidifying
Hmm.
hypermasculinity, and it's
Yes.
contributing to these gender stereotypes, because you can go into probably any school, from my experience in DPS anyway, and it's not just female teachers being predominantly there. There's a lot of different things that are happening culturally inside of schools
Hmm.
that are sustaining horrible habits by our boys, from our boys. And so I think that
Yeah.
that's part of it, and asking those root cause types of questions.
Hmm.
But I think that there could be some things done curriculum wide. I don't know if policy would come in where,
Yeah.
like we talk about sex education and the
Right.
importance of that,
Hmm.
we talk about the definition of manhood, and what it looks like to grow. And a lot of that is left to churches or nonprofits or the home and things like that. But I think that we've got to be sure to create spaces to have those conversations, because I think it ultimately improves everybody's experience, not just the boys. They become more empathetic and compassionate and think about leadership from a different perspective, but everybody in that community will be empowered. And so those are just a few thoughts. I, of course, could go on about what I think our boys definitely need and the differences between boys and girls in classroom settings.
Hmm.
And lastly, just encourage you to keep your thought of asking the students. And an anecdote I have is that the number one word that boys describe their middle and high school experience as is lonely.
Hmm.
And so I think that reaching out and getting some of those, even anecdotal evidence, will help us frame what
Yes.
they best need to support their growth.
Okay. Very good. Yeah.
Um, well, I thank you for your time, Lisa.
Well, awesome.
And
We'll have to
again,
do this for longer. Obviously, I would love to sit with you for longer than our 15-minute little time. As soon as either through video or something, right? Through our COVID time, maybe we can go. Maybe I'll meet you across the street and we can have a conversation. But I appreciate your time, and I do appreciate your questions and your thoughts and your support, everything for kids, right?
well,
Appreciate
thank
it.
you. Thanks
You
again
bet.
for running and being responsive, and for everything you're doing to improve the lives of our children. I appreciate it.
You bet. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.